My name is Anna. I am 27 years old and, until recently, my life followed a predictable, even monotonous, rhythm. I worked as an administrative assistant at a local business, ran a small apartment, and led a simple life. But everything has changed in the last year. First, the unexpected pregnancy. Then the tragedy. My sister Clara, who has always been my biggest support, died in a car accident a few weeks before Kaio, my baby, was born. Losing Clara was like losing a part of me. She was my safe haven, the only person I really trusted. Since then, I've been trying to move on, but grief feels like a shadow that haunts me all the time. Now, alone, I try to be the best mother I can. Kaio is everything to me. He brought light in the midst of so much darkness, but being a single mother is a constant challenge. The nights are long, the sleep is short, and the worries never end. That particular night, I was in Kaio's room adjusting the last things before putting him to sleep. The bedroom is the only place in the house where I feel any peace. The walls are decorated with stickers of clouds and stars, a gift from Clara when she learned I was pregnant. After he fell asleep, I turned on the baby monitor for the first time. It was a modern device, with a camera and audio, which would allow me to hear and see Kaio while resting in my room. I sat on the bed and stared at the screen for a few minutes, listening to the soft sound of his breathing. That's when I heard a hiss. At first, I thought it was interference. I adjusted the volume, moved the device, but the wheezing continued. Then I heard something else. A faint sound, like a whisper. My heart raced. I went to his room immediately, trying to appear calm. Everything was in order. Kaio slept peacefully, and the device seemed normal. I went back to bed trying to convince myself that it was just a problem with the monitor. But when I lay down and closed my eyes, I heard it again. This time, it was a melody. Familiar. The same melody that Clara used to sing to me when I was a child. That melody didn't leave my head. I spent the whole night awake, trying to understand what had happened. Why was I listening to something so familiar? Clara loved to sing to me when we were kids, and that was her song. But now she's gone, isn't she? When the sun came up, I tried to ignore the fear that had been growing inside me. Maybe it was tiredness. Everyone says that sleep deprivation can do strange things to the mind. During the day, I did what I always do. I took care of Kaio, I cleaned the house, I kept busy as much as I could. I turned the baby monitor back on, just to make sure it was working. And it was. Everything seemed normal. At night, however, the anxiety returned. Even with my body exhausted, my mind was on alert. I put Kaio to sleep, adjusted the covers and turned on the monitor. This time, I left the volume very low. I didn't want to hear anything weird, but at the same time, I needed to make sure everything was okay. I lay on the bed with the monitor next to me. The soft sound of his breathing was comforting, but I couldn't relax. The minutes passed slowly, and for a while everything remained calm. Then it happened again. First that same hiss. My heart raced. I picked up the monitor, trying to find some logical explanation. And so, there it was, a low whisper, barely noticeable, but this time clear enough to understand. Do not be afraid. My breath froze. The monitor was shaking in my hand. I knew that voice. Wait, it was Clara's voice. Clara. I whispered, my throat tightening. The voice disappeared, leaving only the hiss. I tried to convince myself that it was my imagination, but soon the squeaking gave way to something else. The melody. The same melody as before. The tears came before I could contain them. It couldn't be real, but it sounded so clear. I didn't have the courage to turn off the device this time. I just stood there, listening, while fear and longing consumed me. That night, I realized that, somehow, Clara was still here. I couldn't get it out of my head. White. Your voice, your song. It was impossible, but at the same time, I knew what I had heard. It wasn't the first time that the memory of her invaded me, but that was different. I spent the next day turning over old thoughts. I remembered Clara so clearly that it seemed that she was in front of me, her loud laugh, her protective manner, the way she called me little sister, even when I was an adult. She had been my strength, my best friend. Since I lost it, the world seemed to have lost color. It was then that I decided to go through the old box of memories that I kept in the back of my wardrobe. It was one of those boxes where we accumulate things that we can't throw away. Photos, letters, small objects that, over time, become relics of happy memories. In the middle of yellowed papers, I found a letter written by Clara. I recognized her handwriting immediately, slanted and full of exaggerated curves. The letter was from a few months before his death. Sis, you have no idea how happy I am with Kaio's arrival. I know that life is full of surprises and challenges, but I promise that I will be here to help you whenever you need it. I have never been able to have a child of my own, but I will take care of your baby as if it were mine. My hands trembled as I held the paper. Clara always wanted to be a mother, but never had the chance. I knew how much she had suffered for it, but I had no idea how she planned to make up for this pain. That night, the baby monitor spoke up again. This time, the voice was clear as day. I'm taking care of him now. I felt such a strong shiver that I almost dropped the monitor. She was here. I had no doubt about that. After that night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Clara was here. In some way I didn't understand. I should feel comfort, right? She was my sister, my safe haven. But what I felt was something different, something heavier. The behavior of the device began to change. During the day, it worked normally. No hiss, no voice, nothing out of the ordinary. But at night, it was as if it came to life. The hiss came first, followed by words or that melody. I started to obsess. Each time she turned on the baby monitor, she sat on the bed, her eyes fixed on the screen, waiting. The pattern was always the same, the hiss, the whisper, and sometimes the words. On the fourth night, I heard something that made me freeze. He's mine now. My breathing stopped. It was Clara's voice, but there was something wrong, something in the way she said the words. It was soft, but it carried a strange firmness, as if it were not just a warning, but a statement. I got up running and went to Kaio's room. He was in the crib, sleeping, but something was out of place. The crib, which was always in the center of the room, was displaced, pushed a few centimeters to the side. I tried to convince myself that maybe I had moved it myself without realizing it. But that night, everything changed. While trying to sleep, I heard the sound of something heavy being dragged. The monitor was on, but it didn't show anything wrong in the room. I grabbed the device and ran there. When I entered, I saw the crib moving very slowly, as if something was pushing it. My first reaction was to run to Kaio and pick him up. He was crying loudly, but he didn't look hurt. I held him tightly, my heart beating as if it was going to come out of my mouth. I wanted to believe that I was imagining things, but it was impossible. Something was there, something beyond my comprehension. And for the first time, I felt that Clara was not alone. When I returned to my room, I placed Kaio next to me on the bed. I couldn't turn off the monitor. I watched the screen, even when everything seemed calm. I knew that this was far from over. That night, I knew I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. Something was wrong, and I needed answers. White, or whatever that was, he was trying to tell me something. But what? And why did it seem more and more insistent? I waited for Kaio to sleep, leaving him in the crib again, and made the most difficult decision. I decided to spend the whole night in his room. I grabbed a chair and sat next to the crib, with the baby monitor on. The screen showed Kaio sleeping peacefully, and silence filled the room. The first few hours passed slowly. Everything was calm, but the air felt heavy. It was as if the whole room was holding its breath. And then, in the middle of the night, it happened. First the sizzle. The monitor started to transmit that familiar sound that I already hated. I grabbed the device and held it tightly, trying to control the tremor in my hands. Clara. I whispered. For a moment, there was silence. And then her voice answered. I'm here. My heart stopped. The voice was clear, unmistakable. It was clear, but at the same time, it wasn't. There was something strange about the intonation, something that made me doubt. What do you want? I asked, with a lump in my throat. I'm taking care of him, she replied, her voice full of sweetness. He needs me. Before I could react, the environment changed. The lights in the room began to flicker, and the temperature plummeted. I heard a dry sound, as if the door had slammed hard, but it was open. Kaio's crying broke the silence. He woke up scared, and I took him in my arms immediately. I looked around, looking for something that could explain what was happening, but everything seemed empty, and at the same time, so full of something invisible. Please, Clara, tell me what's going on, I begged, but the voice disappeared, leaving only the sound of Kaio's crying and my heart racing. At that moment, I knew I was dealing with something much bigger than homesickness. After that night, I realized I was losing control. It wasn't just fear, it was the feeling that something else was taking over my home, my life. Clara no longer seemed just like my loving sister. There was something different, something wrong. I needed answers. I remembered an old diary that my grandmother kept and that had stayed with me when she passed away. She used to tell strange stories about our family. She talked about beliefs and traditions that I always considered exaggerated. That night, with Kaio finally sleeping next to me, I started flipping through the pages. In her diary, my grandmother talked about spirits trapped between worlds. She believed that some souls could not move on, trapped by strong emotions such as regret, sadness, or even love. But there was something more. She also said that these spirits, in their attempt to connect with the living, sometimes attracted worse things. I read and reread the pages, trying to absorb everything. My chest tightened with every word, as if I knew that it explained what was happening. Clara might have been trying to connect with me, but without realizing it, she had opened a door. And something else had passed through her. That night, I watched Kaio sleep. The monitor was off. I didn't have the courage to listen to whatever came of it. But even so, I heard a sound. A laugh. I looked at the monitor screen, which was dark, but suddenly lit up on its own. My blood ran cold when I saw Kaio in the crib, smiling at something I couldn't see. The laughter grew louder, distorted, as if echoing throughout the room. I took Kaio in my arms, my heart racing, and ran to the other side of the house. I locked the bedroom door with me inside, holding Kaio tight against my chest. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Clara was not just here. She had brought something with her. Something my son wanted. After that night, I understood that I needed to act. White, or what I thought Clara was. It was taking me to a dark place. She was no longer my sister. Maybe it never was, not the way I thought. I thought of the letter I found, of her words about taking care of Kaio as if he were your own. It gave me goosebumps in a way that didn't seem possible before. And my grandmother's diary wouldn't leave my head. According to their stories, to free a trapped spirit, I needed something that would connect it to life and, in a symbolic act, leave it behind. I took Clara's letter that same night. I sat on the living room floor, with Kaio sleeping next to me, watching her handwriting as my mind raced. That was the only thing I had from her, but now it felt like a burden. I took a deep breath and lit a candle. I took a metal bowl to burn the letter, just as the diary suggested. My hands trembled as I read his words for the last time. I'll take care of him as if he were my own. I held the letter over the flame. Just as the edges began to burn, an icy wind blew through the room, blowing out the candle. The light flashed, and I heard the hiss again, but this time it wasn't coming from the monitor. He came from everywhere. Don't do that, Clara's voice sounded. She was firm, almost authoritarian. I closed my eyes and pressed the letter against the flame again, feeling the tears roll down my face. You need to leave, Clara, I said aloud. This is not right. You don't belong here anymore. The hiss turned into a scream, a high-pitched and terrifying sound that made me cover my ears. The letter burned completely, and the sound suddenly disappeared, leaving only silence. For a moment, I thought it was all over. But then, in the darkness, I heard one last whisper, charged with anger and something else. You won't get rid of me so easily. The next morning, for the first time in weeks, the house was quiet. There were no squeaks, laughter, or voices. The monitor worked normally, as a simple electronic device should. Kaio seemed calmer, sleeping better than ever. For a moment, I convinced myself that it was all over. The ritual had worked. Clara, or whatever it was finally gone. I tried to get back to the routine, to pretend that the last few weeks hadn't happened. While feeding Kaio in the kitchen, a sense of relief began to take over me. I even smiled for the first time in days. Maybe I would finally have my life back. But the feeling didn't last long. That night, while I was putting Kaio in the crib, a discomfort took over me. The room felt cold, more than usual, but I tried to ignore it. I turned on the monitor, as I always did, and went back to my room. I lay on the bed, staring at the screen. Kaio slept peacefully, his small breath filling the silence. Everything seemed fine. But as the minutes passed, I began to notice something strange. The shadows in Kaio's room looked wrong. They did not move as they should. It wasn't the flickering lamplight. It was something more. I approached the monitor, my eyes fixed on the screen. Kaio's crib was in the center of the image, but in the corner, almost out of the camera's reach, there seemed to be something. One way. I blinked, trying to adjust the view, but the monitor was static for a second, freezing the image. When he returned, everything seemed normal. It's just paranoia, I muttered to myself, trying to push away the fear. But then it happened. On the screen, I saw something that made me freeze. Kaio, still lying in the crib, opened his eyes and looked directly at the camera. He wasn't looking at me. I was looking beyond, for something I couldn't see. A figure appeared for a second, an indistinct shadow that seemed to be leaning over the crib. My heart stopped, and before I could react, the monitor turned off by itself. The sense of security collapsed. Clara could have left, but something worse had remained. I didn't sleep that night. How could he? After what I saw on the monitor, every little sound in the house sounded like a warning, every shadow a threat. I held Kaio in my arms the whole time, my heart racing, waiting for something to happen. When the sun rose, I made a decision: destroy the monitor. He was the connection, the bridge between what was here and what I couldn't understand. I turned off the device and threw it in the back of a drawer, but the feeling that I was being watched did not disappear. The day passed in a blur. I did everything automatically, fed Kaio, tried to tidy up the house, but the fear didn't leave my mind. It was no longer about Clara. It was about what she had brought, something much darker. At night, I prepared myself for the worst. I closed all the doors, locked the windows and put Kaio to sleep next to me in bed. But when darkness took over the house, I felt the presence. The monitor, which I had turned off and hidden, began to emit a low sound, an almost imperceptible hiss. My eyes widened. How was this possible? I got up slowly and went to the drawer. The monitor was there, on the screen flashing. I picked it up with trembling hands and looked at the image. Kaio's room. The empty cradle. But then the picture changed. It was my room. Gaius. The camera seemed to be watching me from somewhere unseen. Now he's mine. The voice was low, cold, and full of something that made my blood run cold. The monitor fell out of my hand and shattered on the floor, but the sound continued. The bedroom door slammed hard, and the lights began to flicker. I took Kaio in my arms, trying to stay calm, but a sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. There was no one there. The hiss turned into a high-pitched scream, as if the very air was being torn apart. Kaio started to cry, and before I could do anything, I heard that grotesque laugh again, this time right behind me. I knew we were no longer alone. The sound of laughter behind me was enough to paralyze my body for a few seconds. My instinct was to run away, but where to run away? We were trapped in the house, and what was haunting us seemed to be everywhere. I held Kaio tightly, trying to protect his small body with mine. I turned slowly, my heart hammering so hard I could barely breathe. There was nothing visible, but the sense of presence was overwhelming. The monitor on the floor continued to emit intermittent hisses, as if something was trying to communicate. Then, he hung up for good, leaving the room plunged into an even more terrible silence. I'm not going to let you take it. My voice came out in a scream, my courage fueled by despair. I didn't know if I was talking to Clara, to whatever, or just to myself. The lights flashed again, now more intensely. The room seemed to pulsate, as if the house itself were alive. The air became dense, difficult to breathe. An invisible force pulled Kaio from my arms, but I held him with all my strength. Leave us alone, I shouted, but the laughter returned, echoing everywhere, filling my head like an unbearable hum. And then I saw it. In the reflection of the mirror next to the bed, a figure formed. It was Clara, or something that wore her appearance. But his face was distorted, his eyes completely black and lifeless, his mouth curved into a grotesque smile. She was no longer my sister. She reached out in the reflection, as if trying to pass through the glass. The whole room was shaking, and I knew that if I didn't do something, she would take Kaio. I took the candle I used in the previous ritual and lit it with trembling hands. You don't belong here anymore, I shouted, repeating the words from my grandmother's diary. The reflection began to fade, like smoke blown by the wind. Clara screamed, an inhuman and hate-laden sound, before disappearing completely. The house stopped shaking. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive, but this time it seemed definitive. Kaio was safe in my arms. But as I held it, I heard one last whisper coming from the broken monitor. I'll be back.